So my research investigates what happens when companies appoint what I call dual directors following the completion of corporate spinoffs. So let me take a step back and talk about what these deals actually are. So a spinoff occurs when one company issues shares in an existing division to its shareholders. And that results in the creation of a new company. So you have the divesting firm, which is the parent company, and the divested firm, which is the spinoff company. And so in reading the legal regulations about these deals, what I found is that companies are actually allowed, parent companies are actually allowed to appoint their own directors to serve simultaneously on the boards of their spinoff firms. So I call these directors that serve on both companies' boards at the same time dual directors. And I look at their implications for the performance of each of the two companies. And what I find is that these directors are positively associated with the average performance stock market returns of the two companies together in general. But then in situations where the spinoff firm makes a large share of its sales to the parent company, the dual directors are negatively associated with spinoff firm performance, but positively associated with parent firm performance. So we have an average positive effect overall, but a divergent distributional effect when we look at spinoffs where there's a sales relationship between the spinoff firm and the parent firm. So there are two key takeaways that I get out of the research, both really interesting, I think. So one is about the prevalence of these directors. So about 60% of the parent and spinoff firm pairs, so a pair, again, emerges from the fact that the parent company is divesting the spinoff company. So these two companies were associated with one another prior to the spinoff, and then they get separated by the deal. So 60% of the parent spinoff firm pairs in my sample share one of these dual directors, at least one of these dual directors, in the effective year of the spinoff. So that's a really high percentage, 60% of these companies sharing the same director, much higher than any other proportion of director interlock, meaning an overlapping director between two companies that exists in regular American corporations. We don't nearly see a proportion like that. And what's interesting also is that even as you proceed a few years after the completion of the spinoff, so let's take 3 years after the spinoff as the example, 35% of the companies still share these dual directors, which is still a really high number relative to what we see among other companies in terms of sharing common directors. So I think that just the prevalence of this phenomenon and being able to identify this is a really unique contribution of this study. No one's done this before. No one's looked at this phenomenon, and that's something that I was able to contribute there. The second key takeaway that I would raise is the idea of power, right? So I was talking before about this positive average effect versus this divergent distributional implication, by which I mean that the parent firm does well, whereas the spinoff firm does poorly following the completion of these spinoffs. And so what this really boils down to is a question of power. So if you think about a firm that undertakes a spinoff, right, the parent firm, this company's been around for a number of years. It's established. It has its management team. It has its reputation. It has its position in the market. It has existing business practices, relationships with other companies and stakeholders. So this company is pretty well situated, the parent company. Not so for the spinoff firm. These companies are created completely from scratch. They have to start everything from the beginning. They have to get their management team. They have to build their reputation. They have to build an analyst following. They have to establish their own business practices. So on average, in general, the parent company is more powerful than the spinoff firm to begin with. So when you have one of these dual directors, in most cases, they're not really going to have any motivation to take advantage of the spinoff firm or do things to benefit the parent firm at the spinoff firm's expense. Right, so they have power. The parent firm has power over the spinoff firm, but that sort of mutes the effect that dual directors will have on the spinoff firm. So that's why we see a positive average effect. In some situations, these dual directors might even help the spinoff firm in terms of establishing itself as a new company. So that's the positive average effect. However, in situations where the parent firm is a big buyer of the spinoff firm's output, in other words, when the spinoff firm is selling a lot of its output to the parent firm, that puts the parent company in a position of even greater power over the spinoff firm, because not only is it established and existing in the marketplace more so than the spinoff firm, but on top of that, the spinoff firm is basically dependent on the parent company as a buyer for its output. So that puts the dual directors in a position where they have both the ability and the motivation to take actions at the spin-off firm's expense to benefit the parent firm, right? So once the power dynamic shifts to the point where it favors the parent firm even more significantly than it does the spin-off firm, this is when we start to see the cost to the spin-off firm, which benefits the parent company, right? So this divergent distributional implication that I was talking about, where the parent firm benefits at the spin-off firm's expense, only happens when there's a situation where there's a sales relationship between the two companies. So I would say that there's implications for the parent and spin-off firms that are involved in these deals, and then there are also implications more from a regulatory and societal standpoint. So I'll take each of these in turn. So starting with the companies that are involved in the spin-off, I think that the implication for parent companies is that dual directors can be a really useful tool with which to manage their relationships with the spin-off firm. So the parent firm has the right to place these dual directors on the boards of their spin-off firm, and that gives them the ability to somehow control or shape the relationship, the spin-off firm's actions, in a way that it wouldn't have the ability to do if it just did the spin-off and that company was off on its own independent. So the implication there is that parent firms can proactively use these directors to manage their ongoing relationships with the spin-off firm. However, there's kind of a dark side to this story in the sense that the dual directors create the potential for opportunism on the parent firm's part in situations where there's this sales relationship. So the dark side is that, yes, dual directors can be a useful tool, but they can also be used for evil rather than for good, and allow the parent firm to take advantage of the relationship with the spin-off firm. So I don't know that I would say that we want to advise parent companies to use dual directors to take advantage of their spin-off firms, but it's certainly an implication that comes out of the research. And continuing in this vein, sort of the opposite implications are true for the spin-off firms, that on the one hand, these dual directors can be a really useful tool with which to kind of ease the separation process of sort of creating a new company, starting from scratch, building up these relationships that I was talking about earlier. However, the spin-off firm needs to guard against this opportunism that I was mentioning in terms of the parent firm potentially taking advantage of the spin-off firm, especially in situations where there is sales dependence between the spin-off and the parent companies. So that's the first implication in terms of the companies that are involved in spin-offs. The second implication has to do with more of a regulatory or societal perspective, and I think there are 2 points to bring up here. The first one is that we need to think about how we classify independent directors, right? So the dual directors that I'm talking about are independent in the governance sense of the term, right? So what that means is that they're independent of the management of the spin-off firms that are separated in these deals. So that normally would be viewed by regulators as a good thing, right? Because they're free from any bias, free from any sort of taint of being associated with the existing management of the spin-off firm. However, for dual directors, even though they're classified as independent, it's sort of a funny situation because they're not really independent in the sense that, first of all, they originate from the parent company. So obviously there's a relationship between the parent and the spin-off firm from before the deal. And so that's sort of a question mark in terms of the independence. The second is that they may have a great deal of familiarity with the spin-off firm from its days as a subsidiary within the parent company, right? So the independence there gets called into question as well. So we hear a lot in the press and popular media from regulators about how we want independent directors as a marker of good corporate governance, and that's completely fine. That's all well and good, but there's sort of gray areas, let's say, in terms of how we see this with dual directors. So I think that that's a regulatory implication that's worth noting. The second point, the second regulatory implication that kind of goes hand in hand with this is the idea that when we think about this positive average effect of dual directors on the average performance of the parent spin-off firm, average performance of the parent and spin-off firms together, that's really masking this different effect that we see for the parent and spin-off firms, right? So yes, we have a positive average effect, meaning that the dual directors are good on average, but in one situation, when we have this high sales dependence, we actually have sort of a redistribution of value from the spin-off firm to the parent firm. And that's not really getting picked up in the overall data because we're sort of seeing the positive average effect. So from a regulatory standpoint, yes, maybe we do want dual directors as a tool to manage relationships between the parent and spin-off firms, and sort of they're beneficial on average, and that's fine. But one has to be careful or mindful of the situation in which we see this high sales dependence, because again, that opens up the possibility of opportunism, and that's sort of hidden by the average effect. So regulators need to be mindful of how dual directors might be misused in situations of high sales dependence between the spin-off firm and the parent firm. So I'm actually really excited about this project. There are three, I think, really useful and interesting avenues for future research that I'd like to pursue in this. So I'll tell you about them one by one. So the first area that I'd like to consider is what happens when dual directors leave the boards of the parent and spin-off firms. So there's three ways that this could happen. One is that the dual directors, remember that they're shared on both firms' boards. So the dual directors could leave the boards, break the dual directorship by departing from the parent firm's board and just staying on the spin-off firm's board. So that's one type of departure. The second type of departure would be that the dual director could leave the spin-off firm's board and stay on the parent firm's board, breaking the connection between the two companies. Or third, the dual director could leave both boards at the same time. So my hunch is that there are very different reasons for each of these types of departures, and therefore there are going to be very different performance implications and management implications, probably operational implications for the two companies. For example, if you have the dual director leaving the parent firm's board and staying on the spin-off firm's board, that might mean that the spin-off firm has finally reached a state of maturity where it's able to function on its own and it doesn't need that connection anymore. Or if the dual director leaves the spin-off firm's board but stays on the parent firm's board, maybe the implication is something like the parent firm no longer needs the oversight or the management of the relationship with the spin-off firm. So I'm really curious to dig more into these three types of departures and think about what their potential implications might be for the two companies, and then to test that empirically. So that's the first avenue that I'd like to pursue in this research. The second is that I'm really interested in trying to understand more about the dual director's personal characteristics. So I was mentioning before that when we think about these dual directors, especially in the context of independence, there are connections between the spin-off and the parent firm in terms of the fact that the dual directors are serving on both companies' board, but really originated with the parent firm. So I'm curious to dig deeper into that issue. Right? So are these directors typically managers of the parent firm? What kinds of personal characteristics do they have? What is their work experience? What is their professional experience? And why might the parent firm be wanting to apply that experience to the spin-off firm in terms of appointing those directors to the spin-off firm's board? And even further, what are the dual directors' financial incentives? They're obviously getting paid by both companies. They're obviously owning shares of stock in both companies since they serve on both firms' boards. Directors all get paid for their board service and have ownership stakes in the companies that they serve on. So I'm curious to see a bit more about sort of where these directors' incentives lie. And this is really one of the novel things about this study, in the sense that it's really the first to consider what's happening to the parent and spin-off firms together at the same time, as opposed to treating the two companies completely independently once the spin-offs are complete. So by looking more at these financial incentives, by virtue of the fact that the directors are serving on both firms' boards, I can actually pull apart some of these implications for understanding how these two companies, the parent and the spin-off firms, work together. So that's the second avenue that I'd like to pursue in my research. And then the third is an even more general question, or an even more general issue, right? So I've been talking about dual directors as managing ongoing relationships between the parent and the spin-off firms. And that's a really interesting empirical context in which to do that, this context of corporate spin-offs. That's really what motivates most of my research, this context of corporate spin-offs. But I would imagine that there are other empirical situations, other professional situations where we do see, or we might want to see, overlapping directorships. So one that immediately comes to mind is a buyer-supplier relationship in general of two two companies that are not necessarily linked by a spinoff. But you could imagine a dual director being a really useful tool to manage that kind of relationship. Another example might be a technological ecosystem where we see relationships between various companies that are participating in the same technological ecosystem. So if you think about a smartphone, the producer of the chip, the producer of the glass that goes on the front, these dual directors could be a really useful tool with which to manage the overlapping relationships between companies that need to work together to put certain products or services together for consumers to use. And so I'd like to try to broaden the lens a little bit of my research to look at other contexts in which these dual directorships or similar types of phenomena might be a useful mechanism to manage those types of relationships.